Hey everyone, those were the unmistakable solos to Comfortably Numb by David Gilmour and Pink Floyd, coming in at number 4 on Guitar World Magazine's Top 100 Solos of All Time. I hope I played them well enough, that is, so that they're unmistakable. I'm going to start this little commentary off by talking a little bit about my personal preferences with regards to the music of Pink Floyd. But it all relates to the song Comfortably Numb in somewhat of a roundabout way, so bear with me for a few minutes. Now, it's a fairly common topic amongst Pink Floyd fans when it comes to discussing the band's classic albums from the 70s, when the band was still a cohesive unit. And that topic would be, who do you prefer? And or, who's the better singer? David Gilmour or Roger Waters? As Dark Side of the Moon is far and away my favorite Pink Floyd album, I personally have to throw my hat into David Gilmour's corner. He sang the majority of the songs on that album, if you didn't know. Aside from his incredible guitar playing, he had and has just a lovely singing voice, something that he doesn't get enough credit for, in my opinion, as it's often overshadowed by his brilliant mastery of the fretboard. Like I said, other than the last two songs on Dark Side of the Moon, Gilmour sang everything else. He was the de facto lead singer of Pink Floyd at the time. With subsequent albums, including Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall, David's album, as Roger Waters flexed his dominance over the band, which included taking over the majority of vocal duties. And that is a damn shame, if you ask me. While Waters certainly had a certain charm, bite, and expressiveness to his vocal style, David Gilmour himself actually described it as venomous. And I would have to agree. He couldn't sing with the same pleasing to the ear quality that David Gilmour did so effectively. He could, however, write profound and brilliant lyrics, unlike almost anyone in the history of rock and roll other than maybe Bob Dylan. So he's got that plus on his side for sure. But again, my preference for Gilmour's vocals could certainly come down to my preference to Dark Side of the Moon as my album of choice, and the otherworldly, ethereal qualities that it possessed. Much of that due to David Gilmour's fantastic and at times beautiful and soothing voice. Us and Them from side 2 of Dark Side of the Moon is probably my favorite Pink Floyd song of all time. And of course, as you may have guessed, it was sung by David Gilmour. Interestingly enough, though, this track, Us and Them, my favorite, was not written by David Gilmour or Roger Waters, but by keyboardist Richard Wright. Regardless, I liked each progressive Pink Floyd album a little bit less than the previous. The more and more that Gilmour took a no doubt reluctant backseat to Roger Waters' dominant control over practically all aspects of Pink Floyd's music. Wish You Were Here and Animals were brilliant albums, don't get me wrong, but the balance had shifted from Gilmour to Waters, and to my ear, not for the better. Though bettering Dark Side of the Moon was a challenge very few bands could ever even consider accomplishing. Take from that what you will. It's just my opinion, one guy's opinion on Pink Floyd, and lots of other people prefer the latter albums over Dark Side. Be it Wish You Were Here, Animals, or The Wall. No one says the final cut. Regardless, you may be asking yourself, isn't this supposed to be about guitar solos and uncomfortably numb? Comfortably numb. So why are you talking about vocals so much? And that would be a very good question. But, my YouTube channel, my soapbox, blah, blah, blah. Actually, in a roundabout way, it all has to do with Comfortably Numb. It's one of the few tracks from the Roger Waters-dominated The Wall album that David Gilmour actually wrote and sings lead vocals on. Thus, it's my favorite song from The Wall. It's also one of the few songs from the album that has stood the test of time and has gone down in history as one of the greatest classic rock songs of all time. Like I said, on an album filled with Roger Waters tracks, the absolute standout track from the album was a Gilmour song, a demo for a song that went unused on his 1978 solo album. He would give that demo to Roger Waters to use on the wall, who would add his own lyrics, but the basic structure and melody were all Gilmour's, and it would become one of only 2 or 3 tracks that Gilmour's voice would be heard on that album. And all of his trademarks were there, held within that gorgeous track. His fantastic voice, that ethereal Floyd quality that the majority of Roger Waters' tracks lacked. Gilmour's well-structured songwriting, and most especially, that bloody guitar solo. One of the greatest guitar solos of all time, of course. And like many other of Gilmour's greatest solos, it's predominantly minor pentatonic work, with a few passing notes here and there from the natural minor scale. Like other solos on this list that I've mentioned this before about, it's not a particularly hard solo to play, but it's hard to play well. It takes an incredible amount of touch and feel to pull off Comfortably Numb with any kind of success. I hope I was successful. At least I think it sounds pretty good. I think I'm getting better at this touchy-feely type of guitar business. It also takes an amazing ear for melody to create a solo such as this. Gilmour is an absolute master at this. Much of it learned from his main influence as a young lad, B.B. King, if you didn't know that. The ability, talent, and knowledge to weave magic with very little. One note or just a few notes, and knowing when the silence in between those notes is more important than the notes themselves. Nobody in the history of guitar, except maybe Jimi Hendrix, was as creative within the confines of the 5-note pentatonic scale than was and is David Gilmour. Now, I understand that many of you may not be soloists, or even guitar players for that matter, so I want to talk a little bit about the minor pentatonic scale, just for a bit, and David Gilmour's mastery of it. The minor pentatonic scale is a 5-note guitar scale used for soloing. It's the most basic of scales, the one that practically every soloist first learns. But not me. I didn't get the memo. I started with the natural minor scale because I just figured this shit out by myself without much guidance from outside sources to tell me otherwise. Regardless, it sits at the core of guitar soloing. Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Zakk Wylde, Angus Young, Joe Perry, amongst many others, and of course David Gilmour, predominantly use the minor pentatonic scale. They would often pull passing notes from other scales when the need arose, but the guitarists I mentioned above stuck within the confines of the minor pentatonic 95% of the time. But why? Isn't more better? How come these guys weren't using tons of different scales if they were considered some of the greatest guitar players of all time? Well, for one, they didn't have to. And at the core of blues and rock and roll soloing, practically everything you need is sitting right there in those 5 notes if you know how to use them properly. There's so much more to soloing than knowing the notes and knowing the scales. There's so much more to soloing than scales. There's phrasing, there's melody, there's bending, there's vibrato, there's knowing when to play a note and when not to play a note. There are hammer-ons and pull-offs. There's knowing which notes work best over whichever chord progression you're playing over. There's timing, there's touch and feel and emotion and on and on. Just because you know 12 scales doesn't mean you know how to solo. There's so much more to it than that. Take Zakk Wylde from Ozzy Osbourne, for instance, a shredder who did know all the scales, but consciously chose to be a minor pentatonic player. Why? Because back in the 80s and 90s, during the guitar shredder golden age, guitarists were utilizing all kinds of exotic sounding scales to try and set themselves apart. And in the process did just the opposite. They all started sounding the same. Zakk Wylde saw this and didn't want to be a part of it. He thought, I will master the minor pentatonic like all the greats before me and use every other weapon in my arsenal to bend it to my will. And like many of the greats before him, he's remembered and considered one of the greatest metal soloists of all time, while many of the shredders from the 80s, well, they're long forgotten. So you see, it's not the scale, it's what you do with it. It's all the other stuff that matters most. And it's this stuff that David Gilmour was an absolute master of, more so than almost any other rock guitarist in history. So in conclusion, for you fellow budding soloists out there, learn your minor pentatonic and any other scales you may choose to learn, especially the natural minor scale, as this is the one that a lot of these guys are pulling notes out of when they're venturing outside the pentatonic. But put your main focus on all the other things that I mentioned: timing, phrasing, bending notes perfectly, pre-bending notes perfectly, vibrato, sliding in, sliding out of notes, expression, trills, melody, legato, feel, all that stuff. That's where the real guitar playing lies, not in a scale. I'm sure David Gilmour would agree, as nobody does these things better. Before I go, just a few words about the tone on this one. I use Bias Effects 2 as per usual. For the amp, I used a Mesa Boogie triple rectifier with the gain on about 5 and the volume on about 6. Not what David Gilmour used. Some compression and a classic Boss DS1 distortion pedal with distortion set to about 3 in front of the amp. EQ on both sides of the amp to boost the mids a bit, and a little touch of chorus after the amp. Delay set at about 370 milliseconds with about 4 repeats, and some plate reverb set at about 20%. The first solo I used the neck pickup with some added tremolo in the signal chain. I think Gilmour used a classic Yamaha RA200 amp with rotating speakers, but a tremolo pedal works a charm as well, I think. For the main solo, I dropped the tremolo and soloed in position 2 on the Strat, bridge middle pickup. Then I manually doubled and triple tracked the whole thing. If you don't know what that means, it means that I played and recorded the solo the exact same way twice. Then took that second recording of the solo, split it in 2, panned one left, panned one right, while leaving the first recorded solo right up the middle of the mix. It's the way that David Gilmour did it. He was one of the very first guitarists to double and triple track his solos. As far back as Money on Dark Side of the Moon, he was doing this. It adds weight and fills out the solo for full effect and punch. Add in some delay and reverb, and it gives Gilmour that quality to his solos that he always seems to have. Plus, it blurs the edges a little bit for the odd note here and there that one doesn't quite nail the way one wanted to. Essentially, you're left with a quadruple-tracked guitar solo. The main solo, right down the middle, one panned about 60% left, one panned 60% right, and a fourth kind of ghost solo down the middle caused by the 2 pan solos on either side. It's a wonderful technique that I use a lot. I'll put down a solo and listen back and think, wow, that sounds pretty good. But when I triple track it, that's when it really comes alive and just jumps out of the mix. So for you budding guitar recorders out there, I highly recommend you give it a shot. It's a game changer as far as recording your guitar solos go. One just needs the ability to know the solo to the note and be able to play it nearly exact every single time. Sometimes that's not the easiest thing to do, however. That's all I've got to say about that one. I hope you enjoyed my commentary and take on this one. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Anyway, stay well, stay safe. Hope you're all good in your little guitar corner of the world. And we've got Leonard Skinnard. Play Freebird. All right, I'm going to play some Freebird next week. And at number 3. So you guys take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time. Ciao.